That's a very good question. I mean, I think it's something like this. We've been convinced, let's say, at many levels of our society, primarily by university-led indoctrination, that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, and that if a young man takes his place in that world, attempts to move ahead, say, attempts to pursue an ambition, then he's following this tyrannical, patriarchal route, and that there's something reprehensible about that he's contributing to the oppression of others or to the destruction of the planet if you take the environmentalist route. And so there's been this terrible pall cast on achievement-related ambition, even if it's in the service of character development. And it's partly because we have this unidimensional view of our culture as a patriarchy, as fundamentally tyrannical. And that's being pushed extraordinarily hard, and it's very demoralizing to people. It's far more demoralizing than people generally realize. And I actually think the demoralization is part of the underground reason that narrative is being put forward. So the fact that the universities are participating in that is so appalling to me that I can barely formulate my thoughts on it properly.
I can see you feel passionately about it. So what you're saying is no.
Yeah.
Joking. No. Here we have a common understanding when it comes to looking at issues that relate to young men, that there's a bit of a crisis of masculinity. So in the United Kingdom, one of the biggest killers of young men is suicide. Now, that's not because young women don't try and kill themselves as much as young men. It's that young men, when they try and kill themselves, what they've realized when they study this is that they are more decisive.
Yeah, they use lethal means. Women commit suicide, attempt suicide more often, but men are much more effective at ensuring that they die.
I mean, have you looked at that? What does that tell you about young men and women when they're facing depression?
Men are more aggressive than women, statistically speaking, which is why the overwhelming majority of people in prison are men. So because the most aggressive people are men. And so men are more likely to use violent means when they do something that's violent, like damaging means. And so you see this in domestic violence statistics as well. Women are more likely to hit their husbands than the reverse.
This is what you're saying from what you've studied, right?
Yeah, the statistics on this are quite clear. But of course, men are more likely to use high levels of force. So, and it's part of innate aggressiveness. And, you might say, well, what's your evidence that that's innate? It's like, well, there's endless evidence that it's innate. Although, of course, these things are modified by cultural phenomena.
I'm particularly interested in the suicide, though, because I imagine that's a result of depression. Now, is that depression a consequence of this crisis in masculinity, young men not knowing how to be a man in the modern age?
Well, it's a good question.
And if so, is the antidote to simply reinforce some of the traditional, some would say, of course, toxic masculinity, some of the traditional roles of men which haven't seemed to have, they haven't seemed to necessarily have been 100% correct in the way, historically men have treated others, especially women.
Well, the thing is, I don't like that narrative. I think it's an appalling way of viewing history. I mean, look, the way that history lays itself out to me, the first issue is that for most of human history, the common person had a pretty damn rough life. It was hand to mouth. And so if you look in the Western world in 1895, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is below the current UN guidelines for abject poverty. And so that's only 140 years ago, essentially. And so you could argue about who had it worse, men or women, but it's a rather futile argument in my sense. I mean, men were shipped off to war in droves. That wasn't particularly pleasant. They did almost all the absolutely catastrophically dangerous work. And so, that was rough. But of course, women had it rough too, man. Lots of them died in childbirth, and lots of them, if they didn't die in childbirth, their children died before they were a year old. And life was brutally difficult, and people didn't live to be that old. And so my essential reading of history is that our ancestors were pretty viciously oppressed by the basic conditions of life, and that essentially what they did in response was to cooperate with one another to try to make things the least amount of dismal possible.
Through a division of labor.
Yes, and yes. And I mean, it isn't as if it was only in 1960 when the feminists had their way that men finally woke up and loved their partners. That isn't how things worked. And so this narrative of universal oppression has reached so deeply into our culture that we have to take it for granted that the fundamental way of viewing history was men against women and men won. It's like women were very different 130 years ago. They didn't have reliable birth control. That's a really big deal. They didn't have reliable toilet facilities. That's actually a big problem. They didn't have any way of dealing with menstruation that was efficient. That didn't even occur until like the 1930s and wasn't in really widespread use till the 1970s. Like, these are big technological changes. And we write that all out of history and say, well, the reason that women had such a dismal time was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no, that's not an appropriate way of looking at the past.